My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 70 years old, and until my grandson's wedding, I believed I understood exactly where I stood in my family. I thought I was the foundation, the quiet root beneath the polished surface. I was wrong. The realization came not with shouting or confrontation, but with a seating chart. An elegant cream-colored board placed at the entrance of a luxury vineyard estate in Napa Valley. I remember how the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass doors, how the violinist played something soft and classical, how guests laughed in clusters beneath white roses and hanging lanterns. I remember feeling proud. I had worn a lavender silk dress I'd saved for, had my hair styled at a proper salon for the first time in years, and in my purse rested an envelope containing a check that represented 8 months of careful budgeting for my pension. I had also brought a diamond brooch, a family heirloom passed down from my own grandmother, intending to pin it discreetly into my grandson Daniel's bride's bouquet before the ceremony as a quiet blessing. When I approached the seating display, however, I couldn't find my name. Whitmore should have been near the center tables, near Daniel's parents, my son Thomas and his wife Evelyn. Instead, after asking a coordinator with a tight smile and a tablet in her hand, I was directed to table 19. It was placed at the far edge of the terrace, near the catering station and partially obscured by a tall potted olive tree. At the table sat the former housekeeper of Evelyn's sister, a business acquaintance no one seemed to know well, and 2 distant relatives from the bride's side who looked equally confused. I felt a small sting then, but I convinced myself it was an oversight. Surely it meant nothing. Surely. During the ceremony, I could barely see Daniel's face as he said his vows. My view was blocked by floral arrangements designed to impress photographers rather than guests. I clapped when others clapped, smiled when others smiled. I tried to ignore the fact that Thomas had not greeted me when I arrived. He had passed near me once, arm around a corporate executive, laughing loudly, pretending not to notice. Evelyn, immaculate in champagne satin, floated past my table twice without so much as a glance. I told myself they were busy. Weddings are stressful. I repeated that excuse like a prayer. But later, while searching for the powder room, I passed by a small private lounge behind the ballroom. The door was slightly open. I heard Evelyn's voice first. "I couldn't risk her hovering near the family portraits," she said sharply. "Daniel deserves a refined atmosphere. We've worked too hard for this image." A woman laughed softly, one of her country club friends. "At least you invited her. That's more than most would do." Evelyn replied, "Thomas wanted to leave her off entirely, but that would have looked worse. This way she's present, but not visible." I stood frozen in the hallway, the marble floor cold beneath my heels. Present, but not visible. The words lodged in my chest like splinters. I thought of the years I had spent raising Thomas alone after my husband Arthur died in a construction accident. I thought of the night shifts at the textile factory, the mornings packing school lunches before collapsing into bed for 3 hours of sleep. I thought of selling my wedding ring to cover Thomas's first semester at Redwood University when his scholarship fell short. I had believed sacrifice translated into permanence. I had believed love secured position. I was wrong about that too. I returned to table 19 with steady steps, though my ears rang. The reception blurred into meaningless noise. Toasts were made. Glasses clinked. Daniel and his bride, Isabella, danced beneath a canopy of fairy lights while a hired drone captured footage for a cinematic wedding film. No one noticed when I quietly removed the envelope from my purse. No one saw me take the brooch back out of the small velvet box. I held it in my palm for a long moment. The diamonds caught the light, flashing stubbornly as if refusing to dim themselves for anyone. I closed the box and placed it back inside my purse. The check followed. When dessert was served, I stood, nodded politely to my table companions, and walked out through a side pathway lined with white orchids. The valet brought my modest sedan around while luxury cars gleamed nearby. I drove home without turning on the radio. I did not cry. Instead, something colder settled in. A clarity I had not felt in decades. If I was meant to be decorative background in their perfected lives, then I would remove myself entirely from the frame. The next morning Thomas called 6 times. His final voicemail was curt. "Mom, you left early." Some of Evelyn's associates noticed. It would have been polite to say goodbye. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "Did you get home safely?" Just commentary on appearances. I stared at the phone for a long time before placing it face down. My house felt different that morning. Not lonely, simply quiet in a new way. I walked from room to room looking at objects I had kept for sentimental reasons. Thomas's childhood trophies, Daniel's crayon drawings, framed family Christmas photos where I stood slightly to the side. I saw a pattern I had ignored for years. The gradual repositioning. Holidays rescheduled, without consulting me. Birthdays I learned about through social media posts. Professional family portraits taken before I arrived. The wedding had not been the beginning. It was only the undeniable proof. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. "Reclaim what remains." The words looked bold and foreign in my handwriting. For 50 years, my identity had revolved around being necessary. What would I be if I stopped volunteering for invisibility? The question frightened me and thrilled me. I opened my laptop and began researching something I had postponed since Arthur's death: extended travel through Europe. I had once studied art history in college before dropping out to marry young. Florence, Vienna, Prague, names that had lived only in books. My pension and savings were not abundant, but they were sufficient if I was careful. Careful I had always been. 2 days later, Evelyn appeared at my doorstep unannounced. Her sunglasses remained on though we stood in my living room. "Thomas is upset," she began without greeting. Leaving like that created unnecessary speculation. I listened quietly. She spoke of reputation, optics, business relationships. Not once did she mention my feelings. When she finally paused, I said calmly, "I heard what you said at the wedding." Her posture stiffened. "You misunderstood."
No, irregular.
I understood perfectly. The silence between us stretched thin. For the first time in my life, I did not rush to smooth discomfort. I did not apologize to make someone else comfortable. I told her I would no longer attend events where my presence was conditional. I told her I was planning to travel. She stared at me as if I had announced I was emigrating to the moon. "At your age?" she asked before she could stop herself. I smiled then, genuinely. "Especially at my age." She left unsettled. I closed the door and felt something shift permanently inside me. That evening I booked a one-way ticket to Florence for the spring. I enrolled in an Italian language class at the community center. I contacted a small art workshop I had found online. Each confirmation email felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a new structure, one that did not depend on being tolerated. I did not know yet how Thomas or Daniel would react. I did not know whether distance would fracture us further or finally clarify what remained. But for the first time since standing in that marble hallway hearing myself described as not visible, I felt unmistakably seen by myself. Florence did not ask who I had been to anyone else. It did not care that I had once been seated behind an olive tree at a wedding designed for status. It did not know about Table 19. And that anonymity felt like oxygen. When I stepped out of the airport into warm spring air, carrying a single suitcase and far more uncertainty than I allowed myself to admit, I felt something unfamiliar, not fear, but expansion. The taxi drove along narrow streets lined with ochre buildings and green shutters, scooters darting past like impatient birds. My rented apartment overlooked a small piazza where elderly men argued over chess games and children kicked a worn soccer ball against ancient stone. The building was old, slightly uneven, with creaking stairs and a balcony barely wide enough for a chair. It was perfect. No one here saw me as someone's mother or grandmother. I was simply Margaret. The first week was clumsy. My Italian stumbled out in awkward fragments. I got lost twice trying to find the grocery market. I accidentally ordered tripe soup instead of vegetable stew and forced myself to eat it out of stubborn pride. But each small mistake felt like proof of movement. I enrolled in the art restoration workshop I had arranged before leaving home. The studio was tucked behind a heavy wooden door near the Arno River, its interior filled with the scent of varnish and aged canvas. Our instructor, a patient woman named Lucia, guided us through techniques of cleaning and stabilizing centuries-old paintings. My hands, once calloused from factory work and later stiff from years of routine domestic tasks, trembled the first time I touched a fragment of cracked pigment. "Gentle," Lucia said, placing her fingers lightly over mine. "You are not correcting the past. You are preserving it." Her words settled deeply. I had spent decades trying to correct perception, trying to edit myself into something acceptable. Now I was learning preservation, not of others' expectations, but of what remained authentic within me. Thomas called during my second week abroad. The time difference made his voice sound distant and slightly distorted. "Mom, Daniel asked where you are," he began, as if it were an administrative detail. "I'm in Florence," I said evenly. Silence followed. Then, "For how long?" "As long as I wish." He exhaled sharply. "You can't just disappear." The irony almost made me laugh. "I didn't disappear," I replied. "I informed you I was traveling." He shifted tactics, mentioning practicalities, my house, my health insurance, my age. I listened without defensiveness. For the first time, I heard not authority in his voice, but discomfort. He did not know how to categorize this version of me. Before ending the call, he said quietly, "Daniel thought you were upset about the wedding." I paused, staring out at the terracotta rooftops glowing in late afternoon light. "I wasn't upset," I said carefully. "I was enlightened." He did not respond to that. After we hung up, I expected sadness to follow. It did not. Instead, I felt steadier. The narrative was shifting, and I no longer felt obligated to explain it fully. Meanwhile, Florence continued unfolding around me. I spent mornings in museums, standing before Botticelli and Caravaggio not as a hurried tourist, but as a woman reclaiming an education she had abandoned at 22. I took notes in a leather journal, sketching details of drapery and shadow. In the evenings, I joined classmates for modest dinners of pasta and wine. There was Greta from Sweden, recently divorced at 65. There was Manuel from Argentina, a widower learning sculpture. None of us were running from scandal or catastrophe. We were simply refusing to shrink further. We spoke about reinvention without embarrassment. I realized how rare it had been, back home, to speak honestly about desire after a certain age. Desire had been labeled indulgent, unnecessary, even foolish. Here, it felt natural. One afternoon, while cleaning a damaged landscape painting in the studio, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. The image depicted a distant village at sunset, the sky fractured by cracks in the varnish. As I worked slowly, removing layers of grime accumulated over centuries, the original colors began to reappear, vibrant blues and warm ambers hidden beneath dullness. I saw myself in that canvas so clearly it startled me. For years I had allowed other people's ambitions to coat me in dust. I had mistaken endurance for purpose. Lucia noticed my pause. "Sometimes restoration is revelation," she said softly. I nodded, unable to articulate the magnitude of the parallel. That evening, I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop to find an email from Daniel. It was brief. Grandma, Dad says you're in Italy. I wish you had told me. I would have liked to say goodbye properly. The message was not accusatory, just uncertain. I read it 3 times before replying. I told him about the workshop, about the piazza, about the way the light changed over the river at dusk. I did not mention Table 19. I did not mention overheard conversations. Instead, I wrote, I'm discovering parts of myself I set aside a long time ago. His response arrived hours later. That's kind of amazing. 2 sentences, but they felt like a bridge cautiously extended. I understood then that stepping away did not automatically mean severing. It meant redefining proximity. I had feared that choosing myself would erase me entirely from their lives. Instead, it was forcing a recalibration. By the end of the first month, my posture had changed, not physically dramatic, but perceptible to me. I walked through the city without apology. I purchased a small easel and began painting from my balcony in early mornings before the piazza filled with noise. My strokes were imperfect, perspective slightly flawed, but the act was mine. One Sunday, while attending Mass at a cathedral older than my entire country, I felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly brought me to tears. Not gratitude for exclusion, but for interruption. If I had not stood behind that olive tree, if I had not heard myself described as something to be kept, not visible, I would never have boarded a plane alone at 70. Pain had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. That distinction mattered. Near the end of my stay, Thomas called again. His tone was different, less controlled, more tentative. Daniel and Isabella are visiting Europe this summer, he said. They'll be in Rome for part of it. He wondered if you'd meet them. I leaned against my small kitchen counter, absorbing the request. Once, I would have rearranged everything to accommodate such an opportunity, desperate to prove relevance. Now I considered calmly. If our schedules align, I'd be happy to, I replied. There was no eagerness in my voice, only steadiness. After the call, I realized something profound. I was no longer waiting to be invited into my own life. I was living it fully, deliberately, and others could join me if they chose. The difference was subtle but seismic. Florence had not erased the wound of that wedding. It had transformed it into origin rather than endpoint. As my return flight approached, I did not feel dread about going home. I felt prepared. The woman who would step back into her house would not be the same one who had left it. She would carry with her restored colors, steady hands, and the unshakable knowledge that visibility begins from within. When I returned home from Italy, my house did not feel small the way it once had. It felt intentional. The same cream-colored walls, the same oak floors Arthur had installed himself decades ago, the same bay window overlooking the quiet street, but I walked through the rooms differently. I placed a framed sketch of the Florentine skyline above my fireplace. I set my travel journals neatly on the coffee table instead of tucking them away in drawers. The space reflected me now, not just memories of everyone else. Within a week of my return, Daniel called to confirm what Thomas had mentioned. He and Isabella would be traveling through Europe again at the end of summer and wanted to meet in Rome for a few days. If that works for you, he added quickly, as if unsure whether I had become unreachable. I told him it did work, but I would not be changing my existing plans in Florence. If they wished to join me there first, they were welcome. There was a pause on the line, not offended, just recalibrating. We can do that, he said finally. The subtle shift mattered. They would come toward me. I realized that boundaries, once set calmly and consistently, begin to re-educate others without drama. Meanwhile, Thomas remained distant. He called less often, and when he did, conversations stayed surface level. I sensed pride wrestling with discomfort in him. He had built a life around control and predictability. My unpredictability unsettled him. For the first time, I did not attempt to soothe that tension. It was not mine to resolve. The months leading to our meeting in Italy were full. I joined a local photography club, surprising myself by enjoying the technical precision of capturing light through a lens. I volunteered twice a week at a small literacy center, helping immigrant women practice English. Their determination humbled me. Many were starting over in their 30s or 40s in entirely new countries with children in tow. Compared to that, my reinvention at 70 felt less radical and more overdue. One afternoon after class, a fellow volunteer named Harold asked if I would like to join him for coffee. He was a retired civil engineer with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor. Years ago, I would have declined automatically, afraid of how such a meeting might be interpreted by Thomas or even Daniel. Now I accepted without hesitation. We spoke for 2 hours about travel, books, architecture, and grief. He had lost his wife 5 years earlier and admitted he had avoided companionship out of misplaced loyalty to memory. I understood that instinct well. Arthur had been the center of my emotional universe for 23 years. After his death, I convinced myself that devotion meant permanent stillness. Yet here I was, laughing across a cafe table with another widower, not betraying Arthur, but honoring the life still inside me. I did not rush anything with Harold. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic romance. But there was possibility, and possibility itself felt revolutionary. When summer arrived, I flew back to Florence with lighter luggage and steadier steps. Daniel and Isabella arrived 3 days later. I waited for them near the Ponte Vecchio, watching tourists crowd the jewelry shops while the Arno shimmered beneath late afternoon sun. When I spotted Daniel weaving through the crowd, taller than I remembered, I felt a swell of something tender and unguarded. He hugged me first, tightly, without calculation. Isabella followed, smiling warmly, though there was an edge of nervousness in her posture. Over dinner that evening, we spoke about ordinary things at first: their apartment renovations, his new position at the firm, her graduate program in environmental policy. Gradually, however, conversation deepened. It was Isabella who approached the subject of the wedding. "I've thought about that day a lot," she said carefully, tracing the rim of her glass. Daniel glanced at her, then at me. "So have I." I did not rescue them from discomfort. I waited. Daniel cleared his throat. "I knew Mom placed you far back," he admitted. "I told myself it was about logistics. But when you left early, I realized something was wrong. I should have asked sooner." His voice carried genuine regret, not defensiveness. I felt the old instinct to minimize, to say it was nothing. Instead, I chose honesty without accusation. "It wasn't the table," I said. "It was the pattern." They listened. I described years of subtle repositioning, the missed portraits, the smaller invitations, the way presents became conditional. I spoke calmly, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a woman stating fact. Isabella's eyes filled first. "I didn't know," she whispered. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand.
I'm sorry, Grandma.
"Not because you left, but because I didn't see it sooner." That was all I had needed: acknowledgement. Not groveling. Not dramatic apologies. Simply recognition. We did not resolve decades of family dynamics in one meal, but something shifted permanently. They saw me as a person, not an extension of their hierarchy. The following day, we visited galleries together. I showed them the restoration studio where I had worked months earlier. Lucia greeted me warmly, embracing me as if I belonged. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet surprise. Later he admitted, "I've never seen you like this before." "Like what?" I asked.
Certain, he said.
That word stayed with me.
Certainty.
For years I had been adaptable, flexible, accommodating. Useful qualities, perhaps, but they had cost me clarity. Walking through Florence with my grandson and his wife beside me, I felt no need to impress or diminish myself. I answered their questions without oversharing. I laughed without filtering volume. When they asked about my life back home, I told them about the Literacy Center and Photography Club, and about Harold. Daniel raised an eyebrow playfully. Grandma has a social calendar. I smiled. Grandma has a life. There was no judgment in their reactions, only curiosity. That distinction felt monumental. On their final evening before traveling onward to Rome, Daniel hesitated before speaking. Dad still doesn't fully understand, he admitted. He thinks this phase will pass. I nodded. It isn't a phase. I know, he said quietly. I think he's afraid of losing control. I considered that. Thomas had been 19 when Arthur died. Overnight, he felt responsible for protecting both of us. Perhaps my long years of self-sacrifice had reinforced his belief that I would always orbit him. My independence might feel like abandonment to him. Understanding that did not require me to surrender it. Compassion and boundaries could coexist. After Daniel and Isabella left Florence, I remained another week alone. I spent long mornings sketching rooftops and reflecting on the subtle but profound recalibration unfolding within my family. Visibility was no longer something I requested. It was something I embodied. Back home, Thomas eventually asked to meet for dinner, just the two of us. We chose a quiet restaurant, neutral territory. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper. We spoke politely at first. Then, without preamble, he said, "You've changed." I held his gaze. Yes. He studied me as if evaluating structural integrity. I thought I was protecting our image, he admitted slowly. I didn't realize I was erasing you. The words were imperfect, but they were real. I did not rush to absolve him. Image without integrity collapses eventually, I said gently. He nodded. We did not embrace dramatically. There were no tears. But as we parted that evening, I sensed that respect, fragile, newly forming, had replaced condescension. It would require time to solidify. I was prepared to give time, but not to relinquish myself in the process. As I drove home, I passed a wedding venue glowing with lights, another celebration unfolding somewhere beyond the gates. For a fleeting second, I pictured Table 19. I no longer felt humiliation. I felt gratitude. That distant table had been a threshold. Without it, I might never have stepped fully into my own life. 3 years after the wedding, I stood in my own garden under a canopy of soft white lights, watching guests filter through the wrought iron gate with easy laughter and unforced warmth. The house that had once felt like a waiting room for phone calls now pulsed with life. Long wooden tables stretched across the lawn, set with mismatched china I had collected during my travels, delicate Florentine plates beside simple ceramic bowls from a market in Prague, crystal glasses next to hand-thrown pottery from a local fair. There was no seating chart.
No hierarchy.
No hidden corners disguised by decorative trees. People chose their places naturally, drawn by conversation rather than strategy. This dinner was not a birthday or holiday. It was simply a gathering, something I had begun hosting every autumn since returning from Italy. Artists from my workshop, volunteers from the Literacy Center, neighbors I had barely known before, and yes, family. Thomas arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine he admitted he had selected without consulting anyone. A small but telling detail. He hugged me without stiffness, his embrace firm and uncalculated. Evelyn followed shortly after, her posture still elegant, but less rigid than years before. She complimented the garden without inserting suggestions. Growth does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in restraint. Daniel and Isabella arrived last, bringing homemade bread and stories from their latest environmental project abroad. Watching them move through my space, not as hosts, not as superior architects of image, but as guests within my world, I felt a quiet equilibrium settle inside me. The power dynamics had shifted not because I demanded apology after apology, but because I refused invisibility. In the years since Florence, my life had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined during those decades of silent accommodation. Harold had become a steady presence, not replacing Arthur, but walking beside my memories rather than competing with them. We traveled together twice a year, modest trips, nothing extravagant, exploring national parks, coastal towns, small museums. Our companionship was grounded in mutual independence. We chose each other daily rather than clinging out of fear. My photography had progressed enough that a regional magazine published one of my landscape series. Seeing my name printed beneath an image I had captured felt surreal. Not because of fame, it was a small publication, but because it represented authorship. I was no longer a background character in curated family portraits. I was creator, traveler, teacher, partner, grandmother. None of those roles diminishing the others. The Literacy Center appointed me to coordinate new volunteers, trusting my judgment and experience. At 73, I felt more structurally sound than I had at 50. Not younger, but clearer. There is a difference. Clarity strips away desperation. I no longer waited for invitations to validate my presence. If I wished to gather people, I did. If I wished to travel, I booked the ticket. If I wished to decline an event, I declined without elaborate justification. Boundaries had become muscle memory. Halfway through the evening, as candlelight flickered across familiar faces, Thomas tapped his glass gently. The soft chime quieted the garden. I stiffened instinctively, and used to being the focus of formal acknowledgement. "I won't make a long speech," he began, clearing his throat. "But I want to say something I should have said years ago." He looked directly at me, not over my shoulder, not around the crowd, but at me. I mistook control for care. I thought protecting appearances meant protecting our family. In doing that, I diminished the person who built that family. A hush settled over the tables. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, though I kept my posture steady. "Mom," he continued, voice rougher now, "you taught me resilience. I confused that resilience with endless tolerance. Thank you for showing me they're not the same." The admission was imperfect, lacking poetic polish, but it was honest. Applause followed, gentle, not performative. I did not need it amplified. The acknowledgement itself was enough. I stood and walked to him, placing my hand over his. "We all evolve," I said simply. That was the truth. Resentment had once seemed justified, but I had learned that clinging to it would anchor me to the same narrow space I had escaped. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not absolution. It is release. Later, as dessert plates were cleared and laughter resumed, Daniel approached me near the hydrangeas. "Grandma," he said quietly, "Isabella and I are hosting a conference gala next spring. It's important to us that you sit at our table." I studied his face, not searching for obligation, but sincerity. "I found it." "I'll attend," I replied, "if I can leave early for a photography exhibit that same night."
He grinned.
"Deal." The simplicity of that exchange struck me. No negotiation over worth, no strategic placement for optics. Just mutual accommodation between adults who respected one another's lives. That was the balance I had fought to establish. Evelyn joined us then, hesitating before speaking. "I misjudged what refinement means," she admitted, smoothing an imaginary crease in her sleeve. "I equated it with exclusivity." I met her gaze steadily. "True refinement," I said, "requires generosity." She nodded, absorbing the correction without defensiveness. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It did not erase the memory of that marble hallway or the phrase, "not visible," but it reframed it. We cannot rewrite past behavior, but we can recalibrate future choices. The difference lies in consistency. And over these years, I had remained consistent. When the evening wound down and guests filtered out through the garden gate, Harold lingered beside me, his hand warm at the small of my back. "You built something beautiful," he murmured. I looked around at the empty wine glasses, the crumpled napkins, the lingering scent of jasmine in the cool air.
Built, corrected gently.
Inside the house, I paused before the large photograph hanging in my hallway, one taken by a fellow photographer during our last exhibition. It showed me standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, wind lifting my silver hair, camera strap slung across my shoulder. I was not centered perfectly. The frame cut slightly at my elbow, but I was unmistakably present. Not ornamental, not positioned for someone else's narrative. Present. I realized then that Table 19 had been a gift disguised as humiliation. Had I been seated prominently that night, praised and photographed, I might have remained comfortably diminished, mistaking proximity for value. Exclusion forced confrontation. Confrontation forced transformation. And transformation yielded authorship. I had not paid them back as my wounded pride once imagined. I had not engineered revenge or orchestrated dramatic withdrawal. Instead, I had done something far more disruptive. I had thrived independently of their approval. That quiet success reshaped every relationship around me. As I turned off the garden lights and locked the door, I felt neither bitterness nor triumph, only steadiness. My life no longer hinged on assigned seats or curated albums. It unfolded because I chose to inhabit it fully. And that, at last, was enough.